Let's go ahead. Welcome to our sixth session in this final course on Master Shantideva's text. Let's go ahead and get started with the prayers as usual. Oh, and I realized I didn't quite pull up the prayers. There they are. Okay. Let's do the praise to Shakimuni Buddha 3 times. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. And then the short mandala offering. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun, and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Hidam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. And then finally, refuge in bodhicitta, first time in English, and then this other 2 in Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chanyan gi pe sonam gi dola penchir sangye drupar shok sangye chodang soki choknam la Jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chunyan gipe sonam gi dola penshir sangye drupar shok. Okay, good. Let's do a short meditation as usual, just spending a few minutes focusing the mind on the breath. And then I'll come in and I'll lead you in a short reflection to strengthen our bodhicitta motivation before we begin. All right, so we'll begin the meditation now. So now let's set our motivation for tonight's class. In the last class, we were examining these various ways that things are produced to try to understand how the refutation of our belief in inherent existence, how this object of negation can be completely eliminated through understanding how things actually are produced and that they are not produced in any of the ways that we're examining. And one of the things we were looking at pertained to the idea of a creator, Ishvara. No doubt for many of us, even though we've been practicing Buddhism for many years, we still have that nagging question of, well, but where did it all start? Where did everything come from? Why are we in this predicament? And the Buddhist answer is always a very simple one, that simply things arise from causes and conditions. The unenlightened state that we find ourselves in, the experience of samsara that we are having every single day, every moment of every single day. All of these are created through their respective causes and conditions. And of course, the opposite, enlightenment, liberation, freedom from all suffering. These too arise from their respective causes and conditions. So this is a kind of a simple answer, but nonetheless one that we may find challenging at times because it entails there being no beginning, but there is definitely an end in terms of our own experience of unenlightened existence. So when we set the motivation of bodhicitta, we are doing so within the context of seeing that this is one of the main causes for being able to attain enlightenment, is to strengthen that motivation, that desire to benefit all sentient beings and to achieve enlightenment so we can do that. And this is one of the main causes that will help us to achieve our greatest happiness, but moreover, to then be dedicated to help others to do the same. So if everything arises from its respective causes and conditions, this is an important one to cultivate frequently, especially when we study the Dharma together. So strengthen that motivation of bodhicitta in your own heart right now, seeing that it is the way out, not just for ourselves, but for all sentient beings. And good to see you all tonight. We're working our way through this last part of chapter 9. So as I said in the motivation in this last section, we went into what are called the diamond slivers. The diamond slivers being the reasoning that is used to refute any inherent production. And there's the syllogism, things of the subject are not inherently produced. That's the predicate. So that together is the thesis. And then we have the reason or the proof, which is because they are not produced from themselves. They are not produced from an inherently existent other. They are not produced from both self and other, and they are not produced causelessly. So we kind of examined the causeless production right off the bat, that things, some spiritual traditions, philosophical traditions held that things just arise. The complexities of things we see in the world, there are no respective causes that, ripen into those various things. Of course, now, again, as I mentioned last week, we know from a lot of our scientific endeavors that there are reasons for every single thing that appears in terms of the marks on a butterfly's wing and what have you, all these various phenomena. So then we went into the refutation of production from self. And again, we're looking at, in this particular section, we're going to start up with again tonight, because we didn't quite finish it, is looking at the idea of Ishvara, a creator God who is behind the scenes, who is the force through which everything in the world is created. And of course, in Buddhist terms, this doesn't make sense because you have this permanent, unchanging, eternal being who is manifesting in the world. I mentioned last week that I sort of saw this as a sense of production from other, but we can also see it as a sense of production from self, because one of the arguments coming back from those folks who hold to the creator God Ishvara was that he's the elements. And so the elements then form into these things. So you have production from self. But the problem is that self, the elements, cannot be equivalent to a permanent, unchanging being. It's just, you don't have the proper criteria for making those two line up. So essentially, we're going to also look at tonight the Samkhyas, who purport that there is a prakriti, this fundamental principle or essence from which everything is formed. But it too is seen as very similar to Ishvara in being permanent, unchanging, unitary. And so to see that something like that could become the manifestations of the world, all the various phenomena that we see arising from causes and conditions, gets to be a disconnect between something that is permanent and the world that we see that is impermanent. So this is the gist of the arguments. Let's go ahead and get back into the slides. We had stopped with verse 123 was the last verse we covered, so we'll pick up from 124 tonight. We're, again, just to get our context, we're in this rather large section of chapter 9, explaining extensively the reasoning establishing emptiness. We went through the selflessness of persons in the first part of chapter 9 that we covered earlier this year. And now we are on to explaining selflessness of phenomena. And that began again by looking at the four close placements of mindfulness, where we looked at bodies, feelings, minds, other phenomena, especially the mental factors, what have you. And then we went on now to this diamond sliver reasoning. So within this, again, we're the section that we're looking at that began with verse 116. If I can find the page that's on, I think it's page 63 of Gyaltsab Je's, is stating the reasons that establish the lack of true existence. So although we've already done some investigations into emptiness of phenomena other than the person, now we're looking at these the Vajra sliver or diamond sliver reasoning. So that's where we began last week with verse 116. We're in the second part of that, refuting generation from a permanent principle and the idea, or I'm sorry, from a separate permanent cause. Going to go on to the permanent principle next. So this is the second outline within this, refuting generation from a separate permanent cause, which again would be like Ishvara, or in, again, the Judeo-Christian tradition, God, Yahweh, whoever, Allah, in the Islamic tradition, the creator who put everything in motion, was the beginning point for everything. So in this section, we looked at the three parts within it. And again, this began on page, same thing, page 63 at the bottom, refuting Ishvara with questions to its meaning. And that was where, like I said, in the motivation, or in that right after the motivation, that we ask, well, what is Ishvara? And they might come back and say it's the elements. And then we say, well, but we agree the elements do change into all these things, but the elements can't be Ishvara because of the conflict between Ishvara being permanent and the elements being impermanent. On page 65, we went into the next section, which is the one that is in brown there that we're in still. If it is permanent, it is unsuitable to be the cause of anything arising from conditions. This is the whole idea, again, of what is permanent is an unchanging phenomenon. It cannot give rise to subsequent effects because that is not, it's not a cause. It's not arisen from other phenomena, and therefore it doesn't give rise to other phenomena after it. So we went through the first three verses in this section last week. Let's carry on with verse 124. So this is all within the same section. If there is reliance, then the very collection would be the cause, not Ishvara. So again, if there's reliance upon various things, all the various elements that give rise to something occurring in our world, then that very collection of things would be the cause, not Ishvara, because we see with our own eyes reliance upon those various factors for things to come into existence. And then the second part, when those things are assembled, Ishvara lacks the power to not produce them, because if the causes are all there, whether Ishvara wants to produce them or not, the result will ensue. And when those causes and conditions are absent, when they aren't assembled, then Ishvara lacks the power to produce them without the causes being there. So we see that essentially Ishvara becomes impotent in the face of dependent arising upon causes and conditions. So here I'm going to use Brilliant Torch And Brilliant Torch, again, is the wonderful commentary by Minya Kunzang Sonam, who was one of the commentators that His Holiness was commenting on in the book that we're using, Practicing Wisdom. And in this section, he says, you might argue that one can observe intermittent results, even with an eternal cause, that is Ishvara, because the necessary contributory conditions are not all present at all times. This might be something that these Nyayikas or what have you, those who are adhering to Ishvara might say, well, there's intermittent results that we see because the contributory conditions are not always there. By the way, we'll see this coming up in a later slide where they do kind of define what they mean by eternal, but they here seem to be conflating these two ideas, which we do in the English language, right? Something that is eternal is permanent, and that which is permanent is eternal. On Buddhist terms, permanent doesn't necessarily mean eternal. Now, in regard to Ishvara, that is true. That's in line with this idea of Ishvara, but when you just simply highlight the eternal aspect of it, that doesn't get at the essential idea of Ishvara being unchanging, permanent in that way, not having any momentary change. So again, this is the argument that it's kind of being put forward. Well, Ishvara does produce things, but only when the contributory conditions are there. That's why we see intermittent results. Things only arise at various times. So then Minyak Konsung Sonam says, Ishvara as the creative cause should not depend on other conditions for two reasons. First, as there are no other causes or conditions which have not been created by Ishvara, his creation would not depend on other conditions, right? Because if he's a creator of everything, well, then he created the conditions too. And the conditions are created, the causes are created. And it does seem like he would just be able to skip right over the conditions and create the final results if he really wanted to, if he had the desire to do so. So it still falls into a problem for these folks holding to this creator God. Secondly, and if it had to depend on other contributory conditions, Ishvara would there and then have to create those conditions. So if there were things that were needed in order for something to manifest, that the moisture and the sunlight and whatever for a seed to sprout, well then, the Ishvara would there and then have to create those conditions if those were absent for that to occur. And again, we don't see that in worldly terms at all. Things do arise from their respective causes and conditions. So going on then to a little bit more commentary, he says, as this is not the case, if he had to depend on other causes and conditions that he could not create himself, then Ishvara would necessarily and certainly be dependent on these causes and conditions being present, and therefore can't be this, unchanging, eternal, unitary being, whatever. It becomes, dependent upon other factors in order to create things. Kind of, again, gets outside of the sphere of what they define Ishvara as. But in that case, these primary causes and contributory conditions would become the cause of creation. And your independent Ishvara could not be the cause. Yeah. So again, this is what the world sees, is that things arise from causes and conditions. They are the primary causes for things to exist. Ishvara can't be the cause based on this logic that was just gone through in that commentary. If the causes and conditions were assembled, this is the last two lines, even if Ishvara did not wish to create, Ishvara would be unable to prevent creation, and powerless not to create, he would still create. Things would come into, again, existence based on the conditions being assembled. If, the seed is in the ground and the sunlight's there and the moisture's there and the nutrients in the soil and whatever else, there's no birds around to, remove the seed from the ground, well, then things manifest, the sprout comes up. Ishvara would be unable to prevent it because all the causes and conditions are there. Without the causes and conditions being gathered together, if they aren't there, if they haven't assembled, even if Ishvara wanted to create, he would be powerless to do so, and so would create nothing. So again, there are lots of problems with this idea of there being a sort of creator God who is behind the scenes, but yet dependent upon causes and conditions, because this is what we see in our world. Verse 125, same section still, it says, if it is created, even though Ishvara does not desire it, it follows that he would be under the control of another, right? If Ishvara has the will to say, no, that shouldn't be created, but things still coalesce and we see various results in our world, well, then Ishvara is under the control of these other factors, these causes and conditions. And even if he does desire it, it would be contingent on his desire. If it is created, how could that be Ishvara? So again, it's this disconnect between what we see that is created in the world and what Ishvara is supposed to be able to do. So I'm going to continue with Brilliant Torch. It says, if Ishvara, without wishing it, creates results, such as the suffering of the hell realms, he cannot be independent, but rather controlled by something else. He isn't this standalone being. He becomes contingent upon these other factors being there in order for those realms to arise. Of course, in Buddhist terms, the hell realms, the human realm, all the various realms of existence arise on the basis of the karma of beings, as well as, of course, the physical manifestations of that in our world that we see through knowing the evolution of this planet, what have you. Even if he does so willingly, he must depend on his will then, his desire. So his being independent is nonsense. And if he did create those sufferings, I like this. This is why I included this in part. If Ishvara did create those sufferings, well, what's so holy about him? Inflicting suffering on others is hardly the act of a holy being. I'm going to take it off screen for just a second because I have to admit this was one of my problems with the Judeo-Christian traditions, and looking at this omnipotent being who was pulling the strings, and what's so holy about a being who inflicts suffering on other beings, who creates conditions where we all have to deal with aging and illness and death and all the whole litany of things. It just didn't make sense. And of course, traditions often propound this as a compassionate, merciful being, right? Well, then you run into even more problems, right? Because if he's so compassionate and caring and merciful, would think that he'd remove us from our suffering immediately. Why have it go on any longer? So, and I know that they've got their own way of explaining these things. I'm not going to go there, but that was my own kind of bone of contention with regard to these ideas of a kind of a theistic approach to things. So then there was an alternate translated. This last verse can equally well be explained as follows. If Ishvara performs acts without wishing it, he must be controlled by something else. But even if he acts willingly, that must depend on a will, which makes nonsense of his being independent. Again, what is the will of a permanent being? If it's a permanent sort of unchanging being, well, then it's another factor again, whether it be factors in our world that control some things or whether it be the will of a being. Well, that will must change because he doesn't will everything to exist at all times. We saw that argument in the last class. Okay, and if he acts, how can Ishvara be an eternal entity? One cannot be eternal, that is, changeless, and act. This is where I told you earlier I was going to see that they do give meaning to what they mean by eternal. But eternal doesn't necessarily mean changeless. As I've said before, our minds are eternal. And our minds are changing phenomena, obviously, changing every single moment. So again, how can something be changeless and act? If Ishvara is acting in the world, willing things into existence, willing things out of existence, whatever, well, then that doesn't make the sense within the context of this being having the property of permanence, being changeless, what have you. Okay, so now we go to the last part of this particular section of refuting this permanent cause, and this is just 2 lines. This third section, it's on page 66 of our commentary. Reminder that permanent particles without cause were already refuted. Remember, we saw a refutation of those back in verses 93 and through 95. We were looking at, I think, the body and getting down to the level of these partless particles. And so this is just another little addendum on there that if somebody comes back and says, well, the world's created through these permanent partless particles, unchanging particles at their very minute level that compound into the various things in our world. So Shantideva says, those who propound such things also have already been overcome earlier on. So if we look at our commentary on page 66, we see that very short commentary from Gyaltsab, the position of the particularists that permanent particles create migrators was refuted earlier with the reasoning refuting partless particles. And there's no need to add anything to that which has already been said. And again, that was verses 93 through 95. So now that concludes the idea of there being this permanent being who is the creator, who would put forward through his will, his involvement in the world, all the various things that exist. So that's not how things are produced either. And as I said, there is a sense of otherness to that, but also when they start getting into, well, what is that being? There's a sense of being produced from something that is the same as it to some degree. So I think that's why it's being put into this particular section that has to do with that possibility within the diamond slivers of something being produced from something that is the same as it. The ones who really propound this to the deepest level, though, are the Samkhyas. The Samkhyas are often called the enumerators because they enumerate 25 categories of phenomena. And one of those 25 is what's called, again, Prakriti is the Sanskrit term. It's generally translated as the general principle or the fundamental principle, primordial principle, what have you. And from that particular nature, everything is said to come into existence. And we get in these first few verses of this section a very brief explanation of what the Samkhyas are saying. Again, I don't want to go too deeply into Samkhya philosophy, but nonetheless, it is kind of interesting. As I said, there was a little presentation in the master's program by somebody who had studied it rather extensively, but I just, again, I still had a hard time sort of making sense out of all of it. The Buddhist refutation seems to make a little more sense. So we get into the first verse and a half that states the position of the Samkhyas. The Samkhyas assert that a permanent principle is the cause of migrating beings. This fundamental nature, element, whatever you want to call it in the world, everything arises from that. It's the cause of the migrating beings, all the various phenomena in the world. The state of equilibrium of the qualities that are called, there are three qualities that are imbued within this principle: lightness, motility, and darkness. Now it's interesting, they're translated in some other contexts as happiness, suffering, and neutrality or something. I mean, there's kind of interesting different translations of these three. But these three principles are said to be kind of the stuff from which the world is made, because when those are not in equilibrium, that is what causes the world to arise, when we have those three elements, qualities out of sync. Let's look at what Gyaltsab says on this. Again, I don't want to get too deeply into Samkhya philosophy, but on the bottom of page 66, he starts by saying this is the enumerators or the Samkhyas position. From nature, which is, we can say, is the first phenomena, comes the great. The great consist of 7 different phenomena. What's called the great one, which is intellect, the I principle, and then the 5 subtle objects, which are 5 objects of the senses, visible form, sound, taste, odors, and tactile sensations. And by the way, if you want to look up the Samkhyas in more detail, you can go to Meditation on Emptiness, pages 321 through 326, and he talks about them, Jeffrey Hopkins, to a great degree. So he says, okay, there's this nature from which come these 7, and from which in turn pride arises. Pride leads to the collection of 16, which are expressions while the person is neither nature or expression. So the person has a particular permanent nature in this presentation as well. So the person isn't a result or a cause. The person is a permanent phenomenon in this. So these various 16, I think the first one, well, actually these are set out. I don't know. I don't know that I need to even go into them. Set out in some of the notes, but again, you can find them in Jeffrey Hopkins. He goes on in the next paragraph on page 67 to say the enumerators posit that out of these 25 classes of objects, again, the 1, the 7, and then the 16, and then the person, it would be the additional one to make it 25. They posit that out of these 25 classes of objects of knowledge, the principle, this nature, has the 5 qualities of being permanent, unitary, and so forth. I couldn't find a description of all 5 of those, but I'm guessing they're very similar to the 5 that were attributed to Ishvara. And we saw those. If we go back to the beginning of that presentation in Stephen Batchelor's translation, he says here, and this was again on, where was it at? I had it in the slides last week. I don't know that I need to repeat it again, but essentially they are putting, oh, here it is, top of page 148 of the book of Stephen Batchelor's translation. Divinity, in other words, there's a divine deity kind of quality to this being. Purity and being worthy of veneration, that's the second one. Permanence is the third. Oneness, a unitary quality, and being the creator of everything. So again, I don't know if those are the same 5 qualities. It sounds kind of strange to have an element of divinity to this principle, but nonetheless, I would, again, some of the qualities I'm sure are very similar. So the idea again is that this has all of these various 5 qualities and is the cause for the various expressions and the migrators. And then Gyaltsep Je goes on to say courage, particle, and darkness, which are the names that Venerable Fedor gives to these 3 qualities, are other words for happiness, suffering, and equanimity. When these 3 characteristics are in equilibrium, they are strongly asserted as the principle. And when they are in disharmony, then they become the worlds, the expressions of the principle. So again, it's a force of creation. I don't know, I don't know what's comparable in our own Western world, if there's anything that's even comparable. Maybe Star Wars, the Force is with you or something, kind of something from which all of these various things arise. I don't know. But this is, again, as deep as I want to go into the Samkhyas. We're going to refute their position by bringing up a number of the points that they put forward. But nonetheless, I don't really want to spend too much time on them. Now we're going to repudiate it. So let's go into the outlines that do that. And we see that within that outline of repudiating their position, we have the actual, which is quite a number of verses. And then the last part, which is the fault, does not apply to the middle way, to the Madhyamikas. Okay. Because they come up with a fault towards us and we say, well, that doesn't apply to us. You're talking apples and oranges. So within the actual, these are rather long titles for each of these outlines. The very first one within the actual is refuting that a partless permanent can be the nature of the expressions. Because if this is what they're putting forward, is it something that is permanent and partless or unitary? How does it become these expressions? How does it even have these particular qualities imbued within it that are in equilibrium? If it's partless, what are we really talking about here? So the very first verse in this section, it is inappropriate for the 3 natures to exist unitarily. I mean, how can we say these 3 natures are a unit, a single thing? If there's 3 within them that can be delineated as parts that are in equilibrium, qualities that are in equilibrium, then you have 3 things. You don't have 1. Due to that, it does not exist. Likewise, the qualities do not exist because they too have 3 aspects individually. If everything kind of comes from this principle that has these 3 parts, well, then everything has 3 parts, and you have, nothing that is unitary. You can't posit anything in this, system that holds up under that type of scrutiny. So let's look at the commentary for verse 128, because I want to go through it bit by bit, just as easier, I think, to keep it going that way rather than reading all the verses and going back through the commentary. The verse on verse 128, the commentary is that first paragraph right after these verses on page 67. And again, there's a Madhyamaka visit missing from there. Remember, we just had the enumerators putting forward their position. This isn't a continuation, obviously, of the enumerators. This is Madhyamika, coming forward with the refutation. Take the subject, object of knowledge. Again, object of knowledge is equivalent to existent. It means anything that exists. It follows, it is unsuitable for forms and so forth, and for a singular partless principle to have 3 natures of happiness and so forth, because it becomes impossible for them to be one. If there are 3 natures, there's not a unitary thing. If there's three qualities within this that are, again, in equilibrium, there's three things. We're positing three, and how are you calling three one? And then if that is impossible, it is also impossible for them to be many, and thus they are perfectly non-existent. So again, all the various manifold aspects of things, if we say that things are unitary, well, then they can't be manifold. And if they're manifold, then they can't be unitary. It's just going back and forth. You can't make those things equivalent. Something that is unitary, that has parts, well, then it can't be unitary. If it has parts, those parts belie any kind of unitary quality that could be involved with that. You'd have to have a manifold principle rather than a unitary phenomenon. Let's go on to the next verse, verse 129. And this is going to be divided into the first two lines first. Let's discuss these. If the qualities then do not exist, also the existence of sound and so forth becomes extremely far-fetched. So if we deny that these qualities exist because, again, they're supposed to be the unitary fundamental principle, this primordial principle, if that's unitary, well, then they can't exist because they're threefold within that. So then all the various things in our world can't exist. We can't find any of this other phenomena. So here we look at the next paragraph on page 67. Gyaltsab continues on these two lines. He says, for that reason, a partless principle, this, again, principle thing from which everything comes forward, in the nature of three qualities does not exist. And we can refute its existence because it is not partless. It has three parts. Likewise, the mere qualities are not truly existent because each of these has, again, three qualities. If upon this analysis, the principle with three equal qualities does not exist, then also the existence of the five objects of forms and so forth become far-fetched, as the five mere objects are accepted as expressions of the primary principle. So if all of the things in our world are an expression of this primary principle, but we've shown that this primary principle can't exist because it's not partless, it's not single, it's not unitary, then how's everything arising? I mean, it's essentially kind of toppling the whole structure by virtue of showing that there are parts to all of this. If there are parts to all of this, then you cannot have something that is partless. Yeah. So then we go on then to the last two lines of verse 129. Let's take a look at those on the screen and then do the commentary. With respect to mindless cloth, right? All the things in our world that don't have, they're mindless matter, they don't have any consciousness to them. With respect to these things we see in our world, cloth, blankets, what have you, it is also not possible for happiness and so forth to exist. Because again, all these various things are arising from this principle, but the principles of happiness, suffering, equanimity, whatever, the darkness, motility, lightness, all these things, don't exist. So therefore we can't have these various other phenomena existing. So let's go on then to the bottom of 67 to look at what Gyaltsab says about this. He says, because they are inanimate matter, I think in one translation it said mindless matter, it follows it is impossible for the subject of the clothes and so forth, all the various things again in our world that arise from the elements, to be of one simultaneously established substance with happiness, suffering, and equanimity. So, I mean, how does that happen? How do you have things that are produced in our world from something that, again, is purported to be partless, but yet has these three parts to it? All of these various expressions of the principle don't seem to hold water within the idea, again, of having various manifestations, manifold things when you are dealing with a fundamental cause at the beginning that is unitary. If entities exist in the nature of their causes, have entities not already been analyzed? So if someone says, well, they do exist within the nature of those, then we've already examined, again, the true existence of various phenomena through the four close placements of mindfulness, looking at the physical things in our world and what have you, and refuted them, particularly when it comes to physical manifestations. We looked at those in verses 78 through 87 when we talked about mindfulness of close placement of mindfulness on the body. So here Gyaltsab says on those two lines, if the functionalities that are expressions, such as clothes, exist truly in the nature of happiness, suffering, and equanimity, which again are those three qualities, which is their cause, then the true existence of functionalities has not yet been examined because they have already been refuted as true. We've already looked at things and seen that there couldn't be this truly existent anything physical, anything that exists at all. We've refuted the inherent existence of those elements, or those expressions, if you will, that are arising from these qualities. According to the Samkhyas, they would hold that they are truly existent as well, of course, because they don't question that level of existence. But we don't see, again, that there's anything that can be truly existent, even though they might posit it as such. In this commentary, it's kind of difficult because there's, again, the refutation is essentially very simple at the beginning. And then it seems like they kind of go into a number of different little avenues, but we end up with the same sort of consequence, which is, how can these things be arising at all? And it says, your causes are also happiness and so forth themselves. Woolen blankets and so forth also would not arise from it. Again, if they're saying that the fundamental principle of these clothes, blankets, whatever, are this happiness, suffering, and equanimity, then these clothes, they can't arise from the principle because this principle doesn't exist. We've already refuted it a couple of verses back. So again, Gyaltsab, I'll just read it and keep it on screen. It says, if, as according to you, the cause of clothes and the like, is this principle, in which the three parts of happiness, suffering, and equanimity are in equilibrium, then clothes and the like cannot arise from the principle because the principle is impossible. It does not exist because, again, it's a partless unitary principle. And they're propounding it to be of three parts, these three qualities in equilibrium. From woolen blankets, there is happiness and so forth. Admittedly, the things we have in our world do bring forth various experiences of these things, all these qualities that are generated on the basis of that. But since they do not exist, happiness and so forth would not exist. Because if the woolen blankets don't exist because the cause of the woolen blankets don't exist, then the happiness that ensues from those wouldn't exist. It's just kind of, again, toppling the whole thing layer by layer, all these various things that we see in our world and we experience in our world that don't make sense if we refute the fundamental cause, this principle that gives rise to everything. So the last bit of that commentary on page 68, if happiness and the other qualities are generated from clothes and the like, then, because clothes and other objects do not exist subsequently, also the principle that contains the three equal parts of happiness and so forth becomes non-existent, because a result without a cause is impossible. Again, if we refute that the cause is there, that it makes any sense, then everything that would arise from that cause would be refuted by virtue of that. It is unsuitable for you to accept this because you accept the principle to be a permanent functionality. It's unsuitable for you to accept that things do come into existence because, once more, you're going back to delineating it as having three different qualities. If it has three different qualities, it has three parts at least. And those three parts belie it being partless and unitary. And this permanent functionality, it's such a strange combination of words, permanent functionality. If we go back to, again, how things are delineated, I said earlier, objects of knowledge is the greatest category of everything that exists. Within objects of knowledge are the permanent phenomena and the impermanent phenomena. And impermanent phenomena are generally equated to what we call functioning things. Things that are impermanent change moment by moment. They arise from causes and conditions, and they function in the world. Permanent phenomena don't function. They exist, but they don't function. They don't act. They don't do things. Emptiness is a permanent phenomenon in the middle way presentation. It doesn't act. It is a state of negation. It is the lack of inherent existence with regard to phenomena. We talked about this a little bit at the end of last week with Fernando's question, that emptiness essentially arises together with a phenomenon, but it's not a caused phenomenon, and it doesn't have its own results. So this whole idea of calling something a permanent functionality is just like trying to find something that is both categories. It's unchanging, but yet it affects things in the world. So again, that's the basic tact that is being used here. Let's go on to the second outline and carry on with our refutation of the Samkhyas. Outline 2 is in the middle of page 68, refuting it to be permanent. So the previous one, again, had to do with how we were showing that it can't be the nature of the expressions. It can't be producing all these various things because of the faults that we found within it having these qualities and so on. But now we're also going to show that it can't be this unchanging phenomenon. Happiness and so forth have never been observed to be permanent. Again, if we say that these three qualities are part of that fundamental nature or principle, well, then they themselves would be permanent. But we've never seen happiness and so forth to be permanent in the world. And we know that these are intermittent experiences. Sometimes we have happiness, sometimes we have suffering, and so on. If the manifestation, happiness, and so forth exist, why is the experience not apprehended? So again, if they do exist in some sort of permanent, unchanging way, we would be experiencing them all the time. There would be no debating about it. We would always have that experience. So the first paragraph, the commentary on page 68, it says, it follows that the nature of happiness and so forth never exists as a permanent or as permanent because it is not observed as such by prime cognition, right? We don't have any valid awareness that can say that there's this unchanging happiness. And again, permanent here means unchanging, not having momentary changes that go on, that go from one thing to another. If these manifestations of the qualities of this fundamental principle are these three, happiness, suffering, and equanimity, then essentially we would have them all the time, which sounds strange. How would you have all three of them at the same time? Because they don't exist simultaneously. But then it says, in case the particulars of happiness exist as permanent functionalities, again, that strange term, then why is the experience of happiness not apprehended at the time of experiencing suffering? Because if it's manifested at all, it would be there all the time. So you couldn't, in the space of an eternal, an unchanging, let's use that word again, an unchanging happiness, because we're getting at this idea of permanence, and things not having that momentary change. How could suffering ever arise? You'd never have any change in that. It would always be manifesting. So it follows that one does not apprehend an unchanging experience of happiness. We go on then to the next part, which includes the last two lines of verse 132. If it becomes subtle, then how is it gross and also subtle? Again, if there are changes in the quality of this happiness, sometimes happiness is very coarse and something we're experiencing at a greater level, and sometimes it's maybe a bit subtler. Well, then how are these changes in the happiness happening if this is an unchanging phenomenon? So let's look at the commentary on those two lines, which is the first two lines of commentary in the last paragraph on page 68. It says, if this very happiness becomes subtle at that time, because somebody might put forward, remember how we had this with the close placement of mindfulness on feelings, and they were saying, well, the feeling of happiness, when suffering is there, but it's not in a grosser form, it's in a subtler form. So you have a subtle happiness occurring at the time of the grosser level of suffering. Well, how is that happening? Again, we refuted it then, but if somebody from the Samkhyas comes forward and says, well, if you have suffering, occurring at a time, then, that went from a coarse version of happiness to a subtler version of happiness. So if this very happiness becomes subtle at that time when suffering is experienced, how can it be coarse and then abandon that status and become subtle? So how does happiness change from being coarse or much more vibrant and experienced at a higher level to something that becomes very subtle? It follows it cannot do that. Why? Because it is permanent. Again, our experience of happiness would be the same all the time. doesn't become lesser when we have a feeling of suffering arising and so on. It would have to be there continually. Now, there's the way that this next verse, 133 and 134, especially 134, I tried to find the best commentary to help me explain it, because with verse 133 first, we see that there's since having given up being gross, they become subtle. Those gross and subtle ones are just impermanent. So if we do see this change, that something goes from gross to being subtle, then that indicates their impermanence. It doesn't show their permanence at all. Likewise, why do you not assert all entities to be impermanent? Because we witness change with them. Things, arise and abide and cease and what have you. So anyway, let's go to the commentary on verse 133, and then we'll get to the really hard verse of 134. And like I said, I'll hopefully explain it with the help of a couple of commentaries from much more astute individuals than myself. So towards the bottom of page 68, those last lines after the first, starting with the third line there, because happiness and the like stop being subtle and become coarse, and stop being coarse and then become subtle, they go through fluctuations and changes. Therefore, this subtle and coarse phenomena become impermanent, right? I mean, just if you say there are changes in these things, well, then the changes there, right there, indicate their impermanence, that they are momentary phenomena and not that they are permanent. So how can, once again, they arise from a permanent creator, this creative force that we call this principle in the Samkhya tradition? How can they be arising from that? Because they are nothing like it. That's permanent and unchanging, and the manifestations of that, the happiness we experience and so on, changes, goes from coarse to subtle, subtle to coarse, and so on. Therefore, why do you not posit the subject of all functionalities, all of these things that we see changing and acting in our world, to be impermanent? It follows that is suitable because they change in their nature from one to the other. So again, we don't see anything but changing phenomena in the physical world and in our own minds and what have you, all these impermanent phenomena. So that, again, flies in the face of them saying that these are all created out of this fundamental principle. So right after 133 in Geshe Yeshe Topson's, and they gave the reference of 133 to this, but this is actually kind of an objection that leads us into 134. And I didn't really see this in any of the other commentaries, so I don't know. I mean, we'll try it on and see how it fits. But so the Samkhyas then object, well, although the various coarse and subtle states of happiness are impermanent, the nature of happiness itself must be permanent. So it's kind of a strange argument, but we have these manifestations of happiness that are impermanent, that go from coarse to subtle, but the nature of happiness itself must be permanent, and therefore is equivalent to this principle, is, of the same nature as that principle, is a manifestation of that principle. So the objection is refuted through the following. Well, if a gross object is not other than happiness, happiness would just be an impermanent manifestation. How does Geshe Yeshe Topten explain this? He says the Madhyamika's reply, since the coarse and subtle states of happiness are not different from happiness itself and are impermanent, then your happiness must also be permanent. So again, if you are saying that they aren't different from happiness itself, if they are in the same nature as that happiness, then they too would also have to be permanent. But you're saying the manifestations of these, the coarse and subtle states, are impermanent, but happiness itself is permanent. It doesn't make sense. How can you have something that is, if it's happiness on one side and happiness on the other side, is just this happiness itself being permanent, the coarse and subtle states of happiness being impermanent? Well, if they're both happiness, how can one be permanent and the other be impermanent? You have to say they're both permanent or they're both impermanent, one or the other. And of course, he throws the consequence back to the Samkhyas of happiness must also be permanent, that all of these various things that we call happiness, whether they be the coarse and subtle states or happiness itself. So when we look further into 134, this is some additional commentary on this, and I think I even included some from Geshe Jampa Gyatso. He goes on to say, are the coarse and subtle states of happiness one with happiness, or are they different from happiness itself? If they are one with it, then when a coarse state ceases and becomes a subtler state, happiness too must cease, and happiness is therefore impermanent. So again, if the coarse and subtle states are one with this happiness, then when happiness ceases, or when the coarse state ceases and becomes a subtler state, happiness must cease. It's kind of a strange argument, but it's essentially saying that if you're going to make them equivalent, then happiness would be impermanent in the same way that we see the coarse and subtle states of happiness being impermanent. And let's go on to then on the other side of it. If, on the other hand, they are of a different nature, if the coarse and subtle states of happiness are of a different nature than happiness itself, this assertion is in contradiction with what has previously been stated by the Samkhyas, that coarse and subtle states of happiness, although different from each other, are of the same nature as happiness. It's kind of interesting because the argument started, if we go back a few screens, with the idea of the Samkhyas saying that the coarse and subtle states of happiness are impermanent, but the nature of happiness itself is permanent. But yet they still say that they're all manifestations of the fundamental nature, the fundamental principle. So I think that's why they're coming back around, and Geshe Eshitopsen is saying, well then, they've got to have the same nature as happiness because you said they did, because everything's arising from the fundamental principle. And so we end up with this contradiction. If they are of a different nature, as they are purporting, or if they are of the exact same nature. If they're the exact same nature, well, then there is an impermanent quality to the whole schmear. You can't say that only the coarse and subtle states are impermanent and happiness itself the coarse and subtle are impermanent and happiness itself is permanent. You have to say that they're both the same because we see the qualities of impermanence in the coarse and subtle states. Therefore, happiness itself must be impermanent. Anyway, that's the best I can make of that. If we look at Gyaltsabje's commentary, it gets a little bit confusing. I don't know, because I just find the wording sort of strange. But this first part of it on the top of page 69, I reworded this. Does the coarse cause exist as a different substantial entity from happiness or not? So if you have these coarse manifestations of happiness or whatever, are they different from happiness itself or not? In case of the first, that they are, because one still experiences happiness, although the coarse cause stops, one has a clear experience of happiness. It is not a coarse cause, because happiness is still being experienced. So when you have a diminishment of happiness from coarse to subtle, you still have happiness. Happiness itself is still there. So again, you would have a change in terms of the causes changing, but you would still have happiness being manifest. And then if it is not of different substance, then happiness clearly becomes impermanent, because when the coarse cause stops, happiness also stops. I don't know. It's a very, very tough verse here to make sense of. But it's getting at the whole idea of, once more, if you start picking apart all these various manifestations of this fundamental principle, happiness, what have you, well, then those things in and of themselves show a changing quality. If they show a changing quality, how can they be produced by something that is unchanging? Because that unchanging nature would have to be the nature of the things it produces. If it's a permanent functionality, which again is such a strange concept in Buddhism, because anything that is permanent cannot be a functionality. It cannot produce things. So that's the best I can make of that argument. Maybe others can do better than me. I'm sure there are many others who can do better than me. But let's go on to the last section of this, because the Samkhyas, again, an interesting little school, but they have kind of a strange concept in the light of Buddhist philosophy. Section 3, starting on page 69, this is refuting that it would be impossible for something to first not exist and then to generate newly. This is where we get into their actual position they hold about the result being already there in the cause. Remember that this is under that whole section of something being produced from itself. Now, again, what the Samkhyas are saying, they're not saying really that at the time of the seed, that the sprout is already manifest, because that's obviously not the case. But they are saying that the sprout has to be there within the seed, or else the seed couldn't be a cause for the sprout. which actually is kind of a way that we tend to look at inherent existence to some degree. We think there's got to be some sort of inherent quality, that therefore things give rise from that. But nonetheless, they do essentially say that without it existing in a non-manifest form, the sprout being there in a non-manifest form in the seed, it could never arise. Now, in Prasangika Madhyamaka, things arise from their respective causes and conditions, and those all are at play in the morphing of phenomena into all the various diverse things we see in our world. But there's nothing inherently there, and there's nothing that is delineated as the result existing in the cause. Because obviously, for that cause of a seed, for the result to manifest of the sprout, it requires much more than just the seed. Many other factors involved that give rise to that whole process. So this is where we get to the actual refutation of something existing in the result existing in essence within the cause, and something therefore being produced from itself, which is, again, kind of a strange concept. Most people in the world would never say this, though they might have some iterations of these ideas. The rest of verse 134. If you assert that which does not exist whatsoever will not be produced because it does not exist, and then it goes on. Let's go to the Gyaltsabje's commentary. Again, if you say something cannot exist because of its not existing, which sounds kind of strange, it says, if your assertion is that for something to generate, it has to exist at the time of the cause. In other words, for the result to come forward, the sprout to come forward, it has to exist at the time of the seed. Then something that does not exist at the time of the cause cannot generate because it does not exist in the nature of the cause. So what then is your meaning of generate? This is kind of the Prasangikas asking the Samkhyas, well, what do you mean by generating? What do you mean by producing? If it's already there in the cause, if the sprout is already existing in the seed, well, what is generated? What do you mean by it being generated? If you're holding that it doesn't exist, unless it's there in the cause. So this is what Geshe Jampa Gyatso, my kind teacher in Italy, I didn't receive these teachings on this text from him, but this were his transcripts from when he taught it for the basic program over there. It says, when it is asserted, since that which is produced must exist at the time of the cause, a result that does not exist at the time of the cause cannot be produced because the result would not exist in the nature of the cause. What do you then mean by production? This is him restating, in essence, what the argument was being put forward from Prasangika Madhyamaka. If this is what you're saying, that if a result does not exist at the time of the cause, you can't have that production, because the result's not there in the nature of the cause. It's not there that gives rise then to itself. Well, what do you mean by that type of production? At the time of the cause or nature, a result exists, but is temporarily not clearly manifest as an object of the mind. It is only when the result arises that it becomes clearly manifest as an object of the mind. So again, this is kind of saying, what the Samkhyas are essentially holding, that at the time of the cause or the nature, a result exists, but it's not clearly manifest as an object of the mind yet. But it exists. It has to exist, or else the result will never exist. It's only when the result arises, when we see that sprout coming out of that seed, that it becomes clearly manifest as an object of the mind. And that's essentially what is said in this next part. 135, first two lines. Although you do not assert that the non-manifest is produced, they abide. Kind of hard to, again, just in looking at the verse, make sense of it. Let's go to the commentary, because we now get an argument put forward on page 69. The nature that, although existing earlier, did not appear as object to the awareness at that time is now clearly revealed. This is what we just saw in terms of what Geshe Jampa Gyatso said. What the Samkhyas hold is that the sprout is there in a non-manifest form in the cause, the seed, but then when the result comes forward, the sprout comes out of the seed, it's then that it becomes an object of the mind, that we can then say, oh, now it's manifest. Now I see the sprout that was within the seed as the cause for that sprout. Well, the middle way then is what's being set out in those two lines I just read from Shantideva. Because you accept the clearly revealed that does not exist as generated at the time of the cause as generated, because you're saying it's there in a non-manifest form, not produced yet, not generated, then although you do not posit the new generation of something that did not exist earlier, you abide on this view that it's still there in a non-manifest form. You accept the meaning and merely do not accept the name. In other words, you're kind of trying to put another name on this and call it something other than it is, when in conventional terms, we say that's perfectly fine. You've got an alfalfa seed, it gives rise to an alfalfa sprout, and you have this whole process of the unfolding of the result that occurs on the basis of it having its respective causes. But they're trying to put like a different spin on it by saying that it somehow is abiding there already in a non-manifest form. But if it requires you to have the result come forward to then have the object of knowledge that it is actually there, then again, you've created this irrational approach, which is really just giving another name to what goes on in our ordinary production. That is a way that they are spinning it on the basis of this fundamental principle, everything arising from that and everything being there in a form, the form of a potentiality. The Samkhya view is that everything exists in the form of a potentiality and within this fundamental principle. And again, things do manifest in a variety of ways. But again, this all seems to be due to these things sort of being imbalanced, these fundamental qualities, these three qualities not being in line. So you have kind of another factor that's contributing to it, but nonetheless, everything's arising from that principle. And then the alternative translation or commentary on this says, or although you do not posit the new generation of a previously non-existent particular or expression, you need to accept that you abide in this view. So it's kind of saying, well, if you are saying that it requires to be manifest in order for us to then know that that's there, well then, again, how are you saying that it is abiding there in some sort of causal way within the cause as the effect already there in this non-manifest state? Like I said, I do think that there is some of that people do hold. When we start clinging to our own view of inherent existence, we think that there's something sort of imbued within that apple seed or whatever seed we're talking about that then gives rise to the whole process by which we see apple trees and all the various things manifesting in our world. And there, again, can be nominal qualities and nominal things that we can set out in the Prasangika view. But there's just nothing that is inherently there. And I think this is the real Samkhya position, is that it's like the effect is already there in a non-manifest way within the cause. And that way, things are produced from themselves because what was there in a non-manifest form is simply becoming manifest. Prasangika says, well, things do become manifest, but you're giving this name to it of this process that's going on and what have you, but that's just your name you're giving to it. And we're talking about things arising in the same way, that things go from a non-manifest form to a manifest form. The sprout is not there at the time of the seed, though, according to Prasangika, and the seed is not there at the time of the sprout. But there's no utter annihilation of the seed, nor is there, non-existence in terms of any of the elements. It's just a causal process that gives rise, that then eventually we say there's no longer a seed there, and now there is a sprout. Anyway, this is, again, some tricky stuff with trying to refute these guys. Let's go on to the next verse, next two lines. If the result abides in the cause, to eat food would be to eat excrement. So they're kind of like wanting to point out the absurd consequences if they do say that the result is already present there in the cause. So Gyaltsab Je says in the bottom of page 69, in the case where the result abides in the cause without being of different nature, then it follows, because if they're all of the same nature, then it follows one would eat feces when eating food. Why? Because the nature of the food and the nature of the feces are partlessly one. So once more, if you're going to spin it that way, that everything is of the same nature, then all the iterations that it goes through are all the same nature. So when it starts off as food that we, that's delicious food that we eat, and that eventually through our, digestive process comes out the other end and not so particularly attractive, well, we must be eating that when we are eating food because it's all of the same nature. This is because you accept the principle as the nature of phenomena, the mode of being, ultimate, and as a partless permanent. as well as accepting the nature of the food and the nature of feces as one, because they're all arising from the same fundamental principle. Okay, so again, these are the consequences that Prasangika is putting forward, essentially saying that if the result is there in the cause, well, then you've got some problems. And another consequence, and it kind of throws it back at them, verse 136, further, if you really believe this, if this is really true, you should buy cotton seeds, and with the price of cotton cloth and just wear the cotton seeds, or wear the things from which that cloth will arise eventually. You just wear the original source of it, and that would be good enough because they're in the same nature. It's kind of, again, a bit absurd, but nonetheless, this is the problem with holding to things coming from the same principle. They're all of the same nature. They're all of, prakriti, all of that, fundamental substance. Further, on the top of page 70, one would have to put the price of cotton onto the cotton seeds when buying cotton. It follows they would be suitable to be worn because the nature of the cotton cloth and the nature of the cotton seed are partlessly one. Okay, so then we get an argument coming forward. I'm going to read this and then we'll go to the screen, read what Gyaltsabje says. What if, even though the two are of one nature, worldly beings cannot see the result at the time of the cause because of being deluded and therefore do not wear the seeds? So it's kind of an interesting comment. In the middle way, we hold that there is a false appearance of things, right? And that sentient beings aren't getting at things quite correctly. Well, they're kind of putting forward their own sort of delusion that's going on, that sentient beings, ordinary beings, are blind to this unitary nature of things. And that's why they adhere to the cotton cloth and putting it on their bodies rather than the cotton seed. Kind of a strange argument, but nonetheless, try it on. And of course, Prasangika's got some holes to poke in that too. So if you say, due to confusion, the worldly do not see it, those who know reality would posit it. This is what the middle way reply is going to be, is, well, but those who do know reality, who are your sages and, great beings who have discerned this, would posit it. And they would wear cotton seed instead of cotton cloth. Why do those knowing reality who exist among the worldly also not see it? If this is the way things actually are, then there should be more people that are kind of purporting that is the reality of things, is that the result is existing within the cause. It's abiding there in this non-manifest form. The middle way reply on page 70. Well then, as you, the Samkhyas, the enumerators, accept your teacher, Rishi Linkhe, and others to be omniscient, and that you know that the result exists at the time of the cause because they have determined this reality with their knowledge, then you eat feces when eating food. Because in your system, also, worldly beings can understand reality. Why should they not see that the result exists at the time of the cause as well? So it's not just even those great sages and beings who have discerned that reality at a deeper level, but even ordinary beings can understand this from practicing that spiritual tradition and learning this and what have you. It follows they see it because they know that the enumerator has determined that the result exists at the time of the cause. And then there's again another commentary that's an alternate one, that the teacher referred to in the earlier line, who is accepted to know reality, is seen insisting on wearing cotton clothes and not cotton seeds, makes it clear that the result does not exist at the time of the cause. So if you see beings who are purporting that within the cotton seed is the cotton cloth in a non-manifest form, but yet you see them wearing cotton cloth and not cotton seeds, well, again, it's showing that it mustn't be reality, because they know that reality, but that they don't abide by that reality. They don't wear the cotton seeds and not the cotton cloth. And again, it's kind of a strange refutation. But these are, again, the absurd consequences that follow from this fundamental principle, this general principle existing as the cause of everything. The last two lines of 137. The worldly is not a valid cognizer. So they come back at that comment we made about, worldly beings having the ability to discern this on the basis of studying these tenets. Also seen manifestations would not be true. Well, then it follows, that other things that beings are knowing in the world and so on would also not be true. There wouldn't be any valid cognition, essentially, because if we're not giving them valid cognition with regard to that, well, then there is no valid cognition. So on page 70, the last part of this, the arguments being put forward from the Samkhyas again, well, because the perception of worldly beings is not a prime or valid cognition, they do not realize it. And they don't address their sages not wearing cotton seed, but nonetheless, this is how they come back. And the middle way says, well, then it also follows that their perception of the particular expression that became a manifest entity is also untrue, because the perception of worldly beings is not a prime cognition. So whatever you are saying is a valid cognition with regard to, if they're unable to validly cognize this, the cause or the effect residing in the cause, well, then they must also be invalid with regard to their perception of these various expressions that come out of the fundamental principle. All of that would then be untrue as well. It's again kind of a strange refutation, because they're essentially saying that some of these ways of ascertaining knowledge and things aren't really, they don't hold water under this view. That we do have to trust. And this is where we're going to go into in this last part. I think we'll start it. Maybe we'll be able to finish it. There's quite a bit of commentary. But this last part goes into kind of Samkhyas coming back at us and saying, well, don't you too posit that there's some falseness going on with regard to the view of worldly beings, ordinary beings? That because in the Samkhyas, I'm assuming, again, I don't know their whole tradition that well, but they say that, when you finally sort of discern all of this at the deepest level, there's some sort of moksha or liberation that occurs. But in the view of ordinary beings, they're not aware that things are arising from the fundamental principle. They aren't aware of how all these things are residing, the result residing within the cause and whatever. And so they're not holding the correct view of things in their regular, everyday valid cognition. So essentially, they're discrediting them in regard to that. Well, the middle way discredits people with regard to the appearance of inherent existence and the grasping at that. But as we saw earlier, worldly beings are not refuted with regard to mere existence. We talked about this a little bit last week, right? The criteria for what is posited as a conventional reality, conventional truth. And we see that again, if the worldly beings don't refute it, if you don't have a refutation at a worldly level, you don't have a refutation at an ultimate level, and it's held to be conventional, well, then we can say it exists as a conventional phenomenon. Worldly beings and worldly consciousnesses do have some authority with regard to establishing, things that exist in our world. Yeah, Sneh.
Thanks, Canton. While we're on the topic of the Samkhyas, because I think like them in the sense that they're saying, the effect has to be of the same nature as the cause. And then I think, that's why when we plant watermelons, we get watermelons. We don't get pineapples. Like, there's no mistake. It's always the same. We don't get silk from cotton. So there must be something in the effect and cause that match.
And again, Prasangika would say that there's no contradiction with how they purport that things are produced, because there's always a dependence upon causes and conditions, and things have their respective causes and conditions. We're just again getting at the fact that their identity is not inherently there. What establishes a watermelon seed and a watermelon plant? Our conceptual mind designating them as such. There's no watermelonness from the side of the seed or the plant or the whatever, the fruit, all of the various things that we say are part of that process, but they still arise from their respective causes and conditions, those being all merely imputed. So again, I do see some of what the Samkhya says as a byproduct, in a sense, of our adhering to things having inherent existence, having an inherent nature within them, that then makes this into watermelon seed, that then gives rise to a watermelon sprout and the watermelon plant and the watermelon fruit and whatever. But Prasangika says, yeah, but it's all just merely labeled as watermelon this and watermelon that. But it's a respective cause and condition, for cause and conditions for that watermelon to arise. Things arise from their respective causes and conditions, but they don't have any inherent existence as what they are designated as. They're merely imputed. It's hard to get our heads around, but I think, again, Prasangi doesn't have a problem with saying that things arise from, because this is the order of the world in a sense. Things arising from their respective causes and conditions. That's why karma is such an essential teaching of Buddhism, right? Because we have to understand the causes and conditions that lead to happiness and that lead to suffering and so on. Forget about watermelons and all the various things that arise in our world. Let's talk about, the real meat of the matter, which is how do we create the causes and conditions for ultimate happiness, ultimate well-being, and freedom from suffering? By abandoning the causes for suffering and adopting those for happiness. And they are delineated, and yet they don't exist inherently. But they function to give rise to various effects. Everything functions within emptiness and within things being merely imputed. I know it's still.
So if you were Prasangika, you would also agree that you can't get silk from cottons and pineapples from watermelons. Sure. That's no problem.
Sure.
And that because of the way things are dependently related, you always observe those regularities. Well, how would they say, so you can give up on the inherent part that there's nothing that needs to permanently link the two.
Mm-hmm. Things, so again, have a causal relationship. Again, there's no causal relationship between a pot and a pillar because they're two different phenomena that have their own respective causes and conditions. But between a watermelon sprout and a watermelon seed, there is a causal relationship that we witness through our eyes and designate as such through our conceptual process. And this is how things come into existence. So again, it's purely nominal. There's nothing inherently there, but it still is upheld. Because again, otherwise, like I said, the whole law of karma would be refuted, because then you'd create causes that supposedly lead you to happiness, but they lead you to suffering because there's no concordant.
It wouldn't match.
Yeah. So concordancy between causes and results is not a problem within the Prasangika view. But them being inherently what they are, is the problem.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. So you can assert concordance between cause and effect.
Absolutely.
And you don't have to go more than that.
Right.
That works. Like you don't have to go to some foundational matter that gives.
But again, I think this is our ignorance at play that wants to go there.
Yeah.
That wants to hold on to some sort of essential nature within it that is established from the side of the object and not from our conceptual designation.
Yeah.
So we see how strong that ignorance is when we look at it at this level. So there's some usefulness to the Samkhya presentation and kind of working with it and picking it apart, because it does get at, as I was saying earlier, some of our tendency to think there's something inherently there. And when they say that the result exists sort of within the nature of the cause, well, that's kind of what they mean, that there's something there that is essentially the same essence as that result, abiding in the cause.
Thank you.
Yeah, but it's tough stuff. Well, maybe we don't have time then to start this because this is a rather long section. It'd be better just to hold on to it for the next time. And I think we're doing okay in terms of finishing. We got 3 more classes, 15th, 22nd. In fact, then when I originally mapped it out, I had us coming up to this point for the second class. So I think we did all right, but know that again, I don't think I've got the perfect explanation of these Samkhyas and what they're about, and even the refutations from the middle way. But the essence of it, once more, is that if you have this permanent principle that is being posited as everything arises from it, when these elements, these qualities are out of whack, well, then once you delineate that these qualities are abiding within it, that are the manifestations then of the world on the basis of that being out of equilibrium, well, then you've belied it being permanent and unchanging and kind of having its own independent nature. And I think it goes it's very much in a similar vein to what we saw with Ishvara, with any sense of a creator God, that anything that is unchanging unitary, abiding kind of on its own, how can that be a force through which things are created? And I know I'm not in any way trying to put down any of the theistic traditions, but um, like I said, that was a problem for me in terms of this creator God, and all the things come from creator God. Well, then there's a lot of garbage that he created. There's a lot of stuff that we have to experience that isn't so wonderful. So, there's problems with that idea of this omnipotent and compassionate being creating all of this. But when I've had a little bit of debate with one of my Christian friends on the interfaith group here about this whole idea of where do things come from, in Buddhist terms, that there's always a preceding cause. It was so funny because they see that as like a fault in Buddhism, whereas I see the idea that a creator God could produce everything as a fault based on Buddhist philosophy. But it's like you have to look at the world in different ways to come to different conclusions. And those who look at it from a theistic bent see that they understand that there's got to be something that's bigger than that process, or something that goes outside of that process, that starts it, puts it all in motion. And then everything arises from that. But, I don't know. It's an interesting debate. Any questions or comments before we conclude tonight? Anyone else? Yeah, Fernando, please.
I have a question. It's in relation to, well, independent phenomena. Is there any independent phenomena, which would mean that it doesn't have an emptiness of inherent existence because it's independent? So is there any independent phenomena that has ever been mentioned in the Buddhist literature? There's no.
No. Everything is a dependent arising. So again, if we look at the three levels of dependent arising, we're actually going to go into dependent arising next week. That's the next argument or reasoning after the diamond slivers, because we only have these remaining 3 verses in this section where we're working with the diamond slivers, and that, I think it's 3. Oh, it's a few more after that. Yeah, that's right. We have another little mini section after that. But after we go on to, we go on to dependent arising, all things arise. If they're impermanent, they arise from causes and conditions. They depend upon those. If they are impermanent or permanent, they arise in the other 2 ways, from their parts, and arise in the subtlest way from mere designation, mere imputation. So in the end, even emptiness itself is merely imputed. We're going to see that coming up as well, is that there's nothing inherent about emptiness. There's nothing absolute, independent, inherent that we find existing anywhere. Not an atom of it, not a single phenomenon. So the whole thing gets torn down. And I think that's the hard part of it too, is because we like this idea of trusting something that we see as kind of the ultimate. Well, emptiness is the ultimate truth, but it is not ultimately existent, meaning when we go looking for it, we don't find it either to exist from its own side. Emptiness is merely imputed. It still exists. Everything exists as mere imputation. I always find it comforting to recall that everything has always existed this way. It's not like, we're discovering something that is, utterly new. It's always functioned and been a part of our world. We just haven't seen it. We are blind to it. And that's again where we're going to take off when we get into the next section, is the Samkhyas coming back at us and saying, well, aren't you too saying that even the valid cognition of emptiness is a falsity, and that it appears to inherently exist, but it doesn't? So if Samkhyas says, yeah, we agree with that. We'll say that there is a falsity to that. But nonetheless, everything has a falsity in the light of inherent existence. And so they take that opportunity to spell out exactly what Prasangika believes in terms of the nature of things, and how conventionality, again, can still be upheld within ultimate truth. So, all right, let's do our dedication prayers, and we'll conclude for tonight. Oops, I'm gonna do the page down here. Here we go. Let's start with this dedication prayer. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. And this wonderful prayer from Nagarjuna to increase our bodhicitta, to protect it, to help it to grow in both the hearts of ourselves as well as all sentient beings. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. And then the prayers for our precious teacher, starting with His Holiness. As we recite each of these two prayers, think that we're creating the causes for the good health and long lives of all our spiritual guides. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. And then for Lama Zopa, you who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers, honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. And we dedicate for all those beings that we're holding in our heart, all those that we know of or have heard of who are experiencing obstacles, who are ill, who are dying, or who have died, and share this positive energy with every one of them, sort of sending it out from your heart, kind of in the spirit of giving in the Tonglen meditation. We're giving all of this energy completely away to all these beings so they can experience complete relief of all their suffering and find all the causes that will lead them to true happiness. And may this result also ensue for all sentient beings. Wonderful. Thank you all so much. So again, the plan is we'll carry on with chapter 9, and in the final class, I'm hoping we'll only have maybe a little tail end of 9, and then we'll do a brief commentary on 10, and then read all of the dedication chapter together as a way of dedicating all the merits from this study. So I'll work on getting the homework questions. I've lately been just kind of swamped getting back from retreat. It was a little hard, but I'll try to get them done a little bit earlier. I think Bonnie got them out there on Friday morning or something. So you can check and see. I don't, does an email go out to people to let them know that the questions are out there? No?
I think unless they come like the day before, something like on a Sunday, then we would send it out. But if it's Friday, I don't think we're doing that.
Oh, okay.
Maybe we will do it. I myself actually didn't look till today. So
Anyway, just know that, yeah, I try to get them to Bonnie by the end of the work week, but I'm hoping that I can get to it a little bit earlier, but this week is also turning out to be, because I'm teaching 4 classes this week, this month, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. So it just means that I've got like class after class and some other things that I have to deal with. So we're at the tail end, so, and I haven't been doing the meditations. I apologize for that, but I'm not so sure how many people were even using them, but that'll be something I'll have to come back around to do at a later point. Enough apologizing. Okay, everyone.
I think you're doing more than enough, Kenton.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
All right, let me go ahead and stop the recording.
Good night, everyone.